Hello, hello. My name is Max Zhao. I will be presenting about the Panic of 1893. The Panic of 1893 was a kind of transition period between the Gilded Age and the Progressive Era. It marked a period of economic recession following the economic growth of the Gilded Age, and during that time we saw a lot of socioeconomic and political changes. To understand the Panic of 1893, of course, we have to understand a little bit about Gilded Age economics to get some context. The Gilded Age is usually defined between the 1870s and the 1890s. More specifically, it would be between 1877 and 1893 because the Panic of 1873 ended in 1877, at least in the United States. So we have this 15-year or so time period with staggering economic growth, but also some serious wealth inequality. So the rich people were just getting richer and the poor people were just getting poorer. And this was actually theorized by Mark Twain and Charles Dudley Warner in their book, The Gilded Age, which you can see on the right. And that's actually where the name comes from. So the phrase Gilded Age was not actually used during that time period. And basically, during this time period, America was kind of catching up with the rest of the world, as in, because this time period occurs after Reconstruction, America was trying to develop its economic prominence on the world stage and become a viable trade partner like that of Britain and France. A major component of this would be the railroad system. Railroads increased dramatically, railroad use increased dramatically leading into the 1890s, although the actual miles of railroad didn't actually increase that much. If you look on the first chart, you notice that railroad construction was pretty prominent after the Civil War, but not as much in the 1880s and 1890s. There is still increase, but it's not as prominent. But if you look on the second chart, if you it's about the net annual change in U.S. railroad mileage between 1831 and 1916. You'll see that it peaks at around the late 1880s and 1890s, and you can see it goes almost up to 10,000 net annual change. And this increase in railroad use allowed for commodities to reach new markets and also expanded manufacturing in the US. It also created a demand for iron, coal, and wood, which should be pretty obvious. But this system allowed for a lot of commodities like farming commodities like wheat and corn to be exported much more easily, which allowed for, if we could move on, more expanded farming in the United States. Between the years of 1870 and 1890, the number of farms increased by 80%, and the value of farms actually increased by 75%. And so this is kind of because after Reconstruction, there was a lot of westward expansion. There was a lot more land that was usable for farming, and we saw a lot of people settle that land and set up their own farms. Farming commodities could not be transported through the expanded railway system, as I mentioned earlier. So this made it much more viable for new farmers. But on the other hand, a lot of this land that was used for farming was actually mortgaged. People were taking out loans to buy new land, and this ended up being that up to 29% of all farmland was actually mortgaged. And all these all these all these factors led into the Panic of 1893. So you have these farmers, right, that have high mortgages on their land, and they're depending on these high commodity prices because they need that income to be able to support themselves. However, on the other hand, the America was also experiencing deflation at the time due to bimetallism, and this was because of the Bland-Allison Act of 1878, which put the United States on a two metal standard, which was silver and gold. And when you this monetary policy where you tie the value of your money to specific metals usually causes deflation when the GDP of the country increases at a faster rate than the amount of metals being discovered. And due to this deflation, a lot of these farmers had to pay back their debt with money that was more valuable than when they took out the loan. And all these factors combined with a series of droughts that hit in the 1880s and the 1890s pretty much caused a crash in commodity prices, and a lot of farmers experienced foreclosures, and this kind of caused a rippling effect that affected the rest of the economy. Some of the immediate effects of this panic were a lot of people were trying to redeem silver for gold, and because silver prices were a lot more fluctuating, so they wanted to get their hands on gold because it was more stable. And then so a lot of groups, especially foreign groups in Britain, were trying to redeem their silver notes and things like that for gold. But and this caused the Federal Reserves to actually run dangerously low, and at some point they were even unable to make that kind of exchange. And also in most economic recession, there were also bank runs. A lot of people were withdrawing their investments due to speculation of economic collapse. That became kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy as more investments were taken out and economic activity slowed down. And of course, due to this, stock prices dropped, and over 15,000 businesses actually went bankrupt. And unemployment rate rose dramatically to over 10% for 6 consecutive years. And the thing about this is that unemployment rate was not actually measured back then because it was not actually something that was kept track of by the census. But there are people that have extrapolated the data from that time period and have been able to make good estimations of unemployment rates. And one is by Romer, and this is seen on the table. You can see from the years of 1893 to 1898, the unemployment rate was actually over 10%, and at its highest was at 18%. For comparison, this would mean the Great Depression at some points was its unemployment rate was around 25%. So this was pretty serious. It wasn't as bad as the Great Depression, but it was pretty serious, and a lot of people were without jobs. And a lot of the blame for the recession actually fell onto Grover Cleveland because in the past, in his first term, he had purposely avoided providing federal aid to disadvantaged farmers because he had a very kind of laissez-faire philosophy toward governing, and he didn't want any groups of people to be reliant on the federal government. But as a result, a lot of people blamed him when the commodity prices crashed, and he believed that a lot of the problems was actually due to the Sherman Silver Purchase Act of 1890. The Sherman Silver Purchase Act was a law that required the federal government to purchase silver from mines to increase the amount of silver coins in circulation. So this would basically decrease the value of silver and relative to gold. And this kind of fed into the problem which I mentioned earlier, where people were trying to redeem their silver for gold. However, he also forcibly put down a lot of demonstrations, and we'll go over that later. And but it's important to note that even though at the time most people blamed the Cleveland administration, it was probably not entirely his fault because it's important to note that Grover Cleveland was actually the one president in U.S. history that did not serve consecutive terms. He is both the 22nd and 24th president. So in the years leading up to the financial panic, the he was actually not the president, and it was actually Benjamin Harrison. So it's not completely his fault as was believed at the time, but there were some things that he probably could have done better. Moving on, one of the strikes that he put down was the Pullman strike. It was very well known. It was basically between the Pullman Company and the American Railway Union. The Pullman Company was a train car manufacturer, and it was affected pretty hard by the Panic of 1893. And what the Pullman Company decided to do was to cut wages for the workers in their company towns, but keep the cost of living the same. So this means that for many workers for the Pullman company now had lower wages but had the exact same living expenses, and a lot of them couldn't handle it. And as such, they formed the American Railway Union, which was led by Eugene V. Debs, and they tried to and the Pullman Company was pretty resistant to any negotiations. So Debs and the ARU they chose to do striking, boycotting, and even tried to stop Pullman cars on the railroads in an attempt to gain better working conditions. However, this did get violent a lot, and it actually required and the Cleveland administration actually did send in the military to forcibly suppress the Pullman strikes. And this led to Eugene V. Debs and many other leaders of the ARU to be arrested. And Eugene V. Debs notably would actually become a leading member of the Socialist Party, and he would actually run for president from within prison, which is pretty interesting. Next would be populism, which is a little bit more different from the kind of socialist ideas of Debs. Populism was a more agrarian focused idea that focused on disadvantaged farmers because e- populism didn't emerge in 1893. It was actually around for a while before that, but populism certainly gained a foothold when a lot of farmers were having a hard time, and neither major party were paying that much attention to them. And so a lot of these farmers became disillusioned with both major parties and chose to join the People's Party. And the People's Party became the main manifestation of agricultural populism, although populism did have footholds in the Democrats and the Republicans. And actually, I think at its peak, it actually had 13 seats in the House of Representatives in 1892. And both populism and the socialism were kind of gained traction during this time. Neither of them really emerged during this time, but in this period of financial crisis, we saw these kinds of political shifts, and these reformist ideas would go into the progressive era, and we would see this idea of taking down the status quo and searching for something better, and that's why we saw such great political shifts after this financial panic. And that's why it's more important. It's not just the financial issues that we care about, it's about the socioeconomic and political changes that ensued. Thank you for listening.